Hello there, my name is Santiago Valencia. Welcome back. And if this is your first time here, welcome. This is the third episode in a series on how to lay out a film score page. If you haven't seen the other two episodes, I invite you to go check those out. The links are right below. But on this one, we're going to really get to the meat of the whole topic. We're finally going to be getting to what actually goes on the page, what it looks like, where things are positioned, the whole thing. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Here we go with our very first example, one of three examples I'm going to be giving you today. Now, before we start on this sample, I just kind of wanted to give you some specifics on what size paper I'm actually using right now. So this is a tabloid size paper, which is basically 11 by 17 inches, okay? That is, I feel, a really good size to have a full score, to be able to read it legibly without being too big or too small. You can go a little smaller if you want to. You can go even a little bit bigger, maybe even 19 by 13 if you really want to get that big. But I think that's a little bit unwieldy. So maybe 11 by 17 might be the perfect size for the score, the complete score view. Now, another note, this is a conductor score. This score is not meant for individual players. This score is meant for an overview of the entire piece, which is typically what a conductor will use in order to conduct the actual orchestra. Later on, the individual instrument parts are extracted from what you're about to see right now and then given to the individual players of the orchestra. So I just want to let you know that up front. This is a conductor score. We're using 11 by 17 size. If you decide to do your own in the future, I think that's a really, really good size to use. So let's get started. Our first example comes from one of my very favorite movies of all time, and that would be Raiders of the Lost Ark by Steven Spielberg. Music, of course, by John Williams. Who else? And we're going to go ahead and kind of break this down. These examples are not going to have notes. These are just an idea of the layout of the score. So you have an idea of where things go where, and, just to understand it a little bit better if you're not used to this sort of score reading, okay? So let's get started. The first thing I'm going to actually go over is showing, once again, the sections that we've spoken about in the last two episodes of this series. So let's bring those up. Here we go. So on top, we have our woodwind section, then our brass, then our percussion, harp, keyboard, and of course our string section at the very bottom. So these are basically where all these sections are going to go when it comes to the instrumentation. Okay, so let's go ahead and zoom in on the top here. And then we're going to go over what you should basically have on every score. Of course, first and foremost, we're going to have a title. And let's see if we can see that. Here we go. So this is our title and subtitle. So of course, the name of the piece is actually technically the Raiders March, and the subtitle from Raiders of the Lost Ark. Now you can put whatever you need to put on here, Symphony Number 2, Movement, 4 at the bottom on the subtitle. So however you feel, you need to label your pieces themselves. Next, let's go to the top right. Okay, these are going to be known as our credits. Music by John Williams, orchestrated by Conrad Pope. I don't think he was the actual orchestrator, although he's a big-time orchestrator today. And then I just put my thing in there, taught by Santiago Valencia. But you could put in there or arranged by so-and-so. You don't even have to put all this. You can literally just put John Williams or the name of the composer, and that is great. But you can go into more detail, music by, orchestrated by, arranged by, and as you'll see in the next two samples, there's some other information we can also put in there as well. So these are the credits on the top right-hand corner. Let's go to the left now, and we're going to go and see this transcribed or concert score. Now, what's the difference? Let me try to break this down as simply as I can. The concert score is basically every note that you see on here would be the same note that you're going to play on the keyboard or the piano. And that note that you would play is the same sounding note that would come out from the orchestra. Okay? Conversely, the transcribed score, because we have transposing instruments, for example, trumpet in B flat, if you wrote on a piece of paper a middle C for a trumpet in B flat, he would play that, but it would sound a major second below. So you would get a B flat in actual reality. So you could have a score that has this transcribed parts on here. So everyone has it like they would be reading it on their own part, on their own music stand. Or for simplicity's sake, we can use it as a concert score. So every note is basically how you would hear it on the keyboard, and the way it would, you see it is the way it would sound. In today's modern, more film orchestras, we're using it more on concert score. From what I understand, we have Danny Elfman to thank for that. Back when he started getting into doing film scores in the late 80s, I think maybe even with Batman, with the original Batman, his original Batman anyway, he started using concert score. And I think everyone just started seeing the simplicity that gave us. And so we continued using concert score from there on in. So this is where you would put whether it's a transcribed score or a concert score. That's very important for people to know, to read it properly, and for the conductor to understand. Okay, moving on. Right below that, we're going to go ahead and have our tempo marking. What's a tempo marking? Basically, it's the tempo at which the music piece plays at. So like the beats per minute, BPM. So in this case, a quarter note equals 126. So our quarter note BPM is 126. We could also put an extra marking on there. Here we have Alia Marcia, which is basically another way to give us a little bit more description on how it's supposed to sound. So that's basically where you would go ahead and put that tempo marking there. Okay, next, right below that, we're going to have our meter marking. And our meter marking is basically our time signature, if you will. Here, it's 4/4. And later on, it can change to 3/4 or 7/8 or whatever the case is. But everyone in this style of score, everyone would have their own time signature, their own meter marking there. All right, moving on, just to the left of that. Obviously, we have our instruments. So in this case, we have a flute, below that piccolo, below that oboe, etc., etc. Now, depending on what instrumentation that you've chosen to write for, you're going to put it here on the score. Does every score have a flute? No, not if you don't want it to have. But this is where you would list your instruments. Now, one little note about the flute. Sometimes I'll see the piccolo flute goes above the flute, and the flute will be in the second line. Sometimes it'll be in the first line like you see it here. It really depends on how you want to do it. I personally tend to like the piccolo flute above because it sounds an octave higher. So if it sounds higher, I'm going to place it a little higher. Visually, it's just going to match what it sounds like. But again, you can pretty much do it any way you want to. Traditionally, though, I do think the flute goes on top and the piccolo goes right below. So there's a big old list, and we'll get, there's a lot more going on when we zoom out. So those are our instruments. Next, we have our clefs. Okay, so depending on the instrument that you have, each instrument is going to go with its own clef. So in other words, if you're playing a flute, the flute player is used to watching his part on the treble clef. If you were a bassoon player, they're used to seeing theirs on a bass clef, okay? If we go down all the way, we're going to see the viola, and the viola likes to see his part in an alto clef, which is this one right here, okay? So those are the clefs that are going to go corresponding to which instrument you've decided to write for, okay? Next, we have two types of brackets. And the first bracket I'm going to talk to you about is this one here, okay? This is kind of like an instrument bracket that joins similar instruments. In this case, the flute and the piccolo, they are similar instruments. They're both flutes. So we'll go ahead and put them in kind of a bracket. Same thing with the oboe and the English horn. Most oboe players can play the English horn because it's such a close related instrument. Same thing with the clarinet and the bass clarinet and so forth and so forth. So we'll see those brackets joining those like instruments. The next bracket that we're going to look at is, let's move down here a little bit, is kind of what I'm calling the instrument family bracket, okay? Now, this is joining basically all of the brass section, okay? If I go up, this other one right here that you can see here is joining all the woodwinds. If I go down, here's our percussion. Here's our timpani and our percussion 1 and 2. And here's that bracket we're looking at. That's joining those. So it kind of helps the eye see and gather where our instrument families are going. Same thing you'll see down here in the strings. Violin 1, 2, viola, violoncello, and contrabass. You're going to be seeing, it's going to be joined by this more of a family instrument, or if you will, even a section bracket. So if I go out here and show our sections one more time, you're going to see that they essentially correspond to those brackets that we're talking about. Let me zoom in here for you. So there's that bracket. It's joining the whole brass section, okay? So that's the second kind of bracket that we are looking at, okay? All righty, let's bring those back. All right, next, the number of instruments. Let me go ahead and zoom in one more time. Now, if we're looking at the trombones in this section, in this situation, they're receiving 2 staffs. And the first one, we're going to be playing the first and second trombone. And on the second, we're going to be having the third and optional 4th trombone player on this line here, okay? So same thing with right above the B flat trumpet. We have 1 and 2 on this staff and 3 and 4 on this staff as well. This is kind of telling us how many players are playing that particular instrument. B flat trumpets, we have 4. Trombones, we have 3, optional 4. Percussion down here, we have apparently 2. So that's basically letting us know how many instrument players are playing that particular instrument. All right, next, let's go back to the bottom. And down here, we're going to see our bar numbers, okay? Sometimes people like to put their bar numbers in squares or rectangles. Sometimes they'll leave them outside just by themselves, maybe put them in bold so they're a little easier to read. But here we're going to see our bar numbers. So bar 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. On the next page, theoretically, we would have bar 7 through 12, so forth and so forth. That being said, in most cases, I do think that 6 measures or bars per page is, I would say, the average. Sometimes we'll see as little as 4 or 5, or maybe as much as 8. I think any more than 8 and things started getting really, really crowded. So I think 6 is a really nice medium amount to have on for each page, okay? All right, and then lastly, let's go to the very bottom here. And we're gonna have our copyright and contact information here at the very bottom. Here it's copyright 1981 by Bantham Music, and other more information that you can put on there. Nowadays, you might put an email or a website, however you feel is the right information down there for you. But of course, you want to put your copyright once you've done your masterpiece, and people know how to get in contact with you if they ever want to, hopefully give you some work. Okay, so let me pull everything up here. And this is our first sample, okay? Pretty much all complete there. All right, let's go ahead and move on to our second sample, where I'll show you some differences and some uniqueness depending on the copyist and composer on how they like seeing their scores all put on the page. Okay, that was our first sample. Let's move on to our second sample. This one is a little bit different, and I'm going to walk you through this style of score as well, with another of my very favorite cues of film music that just came out just a couple years ago. If you have seen the movie Red Sparrow with Jennifer Lawrence, great little spy international movie I thought was really awesome, scored by none other than James Howard Newton. And this is the layout of what he used in the cue Overture. Okay, so let's get started on this one. We'll go a little bit faster since we've already kind of seen the main parts on the last sample. Let's just see what the differences are here. Let me go ahead and show you all of the sections here. We have the woodwind, brass, percussion, harp, keyboard, and string sections. All right, let's zoom in to the top here. As before, we have our title. And in this particular situation, we have a little bit more information on this style. We have our title, which is Overture, but we also have our cue number. And below that, we have our subtitle. Okay, so what's the cue number? It's this number here, the 1M1 V23. Now, depending on how you're going to be getting your footage from the director and the editor, depends on how they're going to number the scheming of every scene that you're going to go ahead and receive and then score for, okay? So in this particular case, what's going on here is the first number 1 is real number. So real number 1. Then M stands for music, and then the one after M is Q1. So real 1, music Q1. Then the V23, I'm assuming that they're probably doing a version 23, or it could theoretically be another type of naming or numbering convention that is specific to their workflow for the movie. After that, of course, we have our Overture, and from Red Sparrow is what I'm using for our subtitle there. Okay, so depending on what situation you're working in, your director/editor will let you know how your cues for that project are going to be numbered. Okay, credits, here we go. Music by James Howard Newton, orchestrated by Jeff Adamajian, if I'm pronouncing that right. And I believe those are the actual people who worked on this score. Moving over to the left, we have our concert score. So this one's in concert score. And our tempo marking is 98. There should be a little quarter note or whatever equals the 98. We're missing that right now, but just pretend it's there for now. Next, we have our flutes, our instruments. This is very similar to the last one. Of course, our clefs. And one major thing that we're going to be updating here, if you haven't already seen it, because it's pretty hard not to, is our meter markings, okay? So in this case, instead of every instrument having its own time signature, like 4/4 on the English horn, B flat clarinet, blah, 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 we're going to go ahead and only put maybe 3 or 4 on the entire page. We're going to make them a little bit oversized so to not have to necessarily number every one. It's kind of like a shortcut, but now notation, when people used to write it by hand, it was a shortcut. But now notation programs are creating that shortcut in the notation as well. So that's what we're looking at as the large meter marking. And if there's a time signature change, it'll just happen. Like in this case on measure 5, we're changing to 7/8 time from 4/4. And et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so now let me draw your attention over here to the B flat bass clarinet. In this particular music, we have 2 B flat clarinets, 1 and 2 right above there. And then in the bass clarinet, we have 1 clarinet. But in parentheses, you're seeing the B flat clarinet 3. This basically means that the bass clarinet player can also play the B flat regular clarinet. So he can switch back and forth. That being said, if we look over to our right, we have a player instruction. So when he gets to measure 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, he's instructed to change from the B flat clarinet to the bass clarinet. So that's just kind of a player instruction, a little extra tidbit that I wanted to put in there for you. There'll be tons of other instructions as the piece goes on, but this is an example of one of those. Okay, as before, we have our brackets and our family brackets, like I showed you in the last example, the number of instrument players per instrument, and let us move down to this section here. This is something a little different. So let's work on our comments. So now you can see that this particular layout has the sections maybe a little bit more spaced out so that they're able to put some notes in, okay? This is kind of like a comment, a note. The slurs and the strings indicate phrases and not always bowings. So this is an example of that. And you can basically go ahead and put that pretty much anywhere you feel you need to. You just have to go ahead and make room for it in your layout. Next, we have our percussion. So let's zoom in here. So our percussion, in the last example, we had 2 percussion players, each with their own 5-line staff, okay? In this situation, we actually have 3 percussion things going on. Number 1, number 2, and a GR casa, which is a fancy way of saying bass drum. But now here, we actually have single-line percussion staves. So we're no longer using the 5-line, we're using single line. So this is another way to go ahead and notate percussion. All right, moving on to bar numbers. Now, from last time, we had our bar numbers here in the last example in squares at the bottom. This time, we've gone ahead and put them just below the middle of the page. So let me zoom out. Here's our bar numbers here. Now, does that make it easier to read? Some would say yes, some would say no. I think it might make it a little bit easier to read, and that's really the only reason. It's just so you don't have to look all the way down to the page to see what bar you're in. You can look somewhere in the middle and go, okay, now I don't have to take my attention so far away from the top in order to just see what bar number we're at. And then my own personal note, why hasn't James Howard Newton received an Oscar yet? I don't know, because he is amazing. And if he ever deserved an Oscar, it was definitely for this movie, because this movie, the music on this movie just was amazing. So, all right, so let's go ahead and zoom that out, and let me put in the sections one more time. And there we go. There's our full overview for our second example. All right, let's move on to our last example. Okay, that was our second sample. Let's go ahead and move on to our last sample. Now, this last example I'm going to show you is a little bit more technical. This one was made with the purpose of having in the recording studio between the conductor, between the composer, all the players in the orchestra, and people actually in the recording booth. So this one has a little bit more technical information, but I just kind of wanted to go over it with you so you're not unfamiliar with what might happen in the real world, okay? So in this particular situation, we are going to be going over the cue, training reversal / pups from 102 Dalmatians, music by David Newman, and in this particular case, I believe it was orchestrated by Alexander Janko. All right, so as before, we have our title, and subtitle. We have our credits. Now, if you notice something a little different on this one, we have music by, orchestrated by, and at the bottom we have BMI. What is BMI? Well, for those of you who may or may not know, BMI is one of the 3 major PROs that we have here in the United States. What's a PRO? A Performing Rights Organization, okay? These are the guys that collect the money for us songwriters, us composers, so that we can get paid. So you will either belong to BMI, ASCAP, or CSAC. Those are the 3 that are here in the United States. If you're in a different country, you're going to have different ones depending on what country you're in. But in this particular case, David Newman belongs to BMI, and that's how that goes. So you can go ahead and put that information as well if you need to. Okay, going over to the left, we have our click track, our tempo, and our info. So here we don't just simply have, a BPM. We're going to probably be having a little bit more technical capabilities here. The clicks is 8 to 0. This is all technical stuff that you're able to go ahead and put on there. But of course, we still have the BPM, which is 160 in this case here. Okay, we have our instrument, our bracket as we've gone over, our clefs, of course, our large meter marking, we've gone over that. Our second bracket, the big one, that is the family bracket there. Number of instruments. We have our single line percussion. In this case, we only have 2, so 1 and 2 percussion. And then we have a section here that's a little bit more, advanced, complicated maybe, or a little bit more customized, if you will. And this is the comment section now, okay? So in the comment sections, we're going to basically have one straight line with divisions here depending on the bar or measure we're in. In these boxes, again, we're going to be talking about SMPTE code, the videotape number, the date, start time, blah, blah, blah. So again, this is all much more technical depending on the project that you're working on. In this case, I'm pretty certain that they were using pre-records. So the orchestra was recording to things that had been previously recorded. So they're putting them together in the recording process here. So that's why there's a lot more technical information with this so that they can sync things up properly. All right, then we also, in this comment section, we can have, play instructions. Here we would have a crescendo, poco a poco, and a lot of other instructions you can go as well. So now in this particular section here, we're now going to have time. So I'm going to go ahead and call this clock time, okay? Clock time basically is telling us, because if the orchestra is playing along to the pre-record, they have to be synced up in time as well as measure and everything. Here in measure 1, 2, 3, 4, pretty much everyone's going to be on second number 4. Then second 6 in the 5th measure. 6th measure, everyone should be at second 8, etc., etc. So we have this clock time going on in the comments section so that we know, and the orchestra and the conductor knows, that everything is being synced up to the pre-records. We've moved our bar numbers down to the bottom in this sample. Okay. And there we go. Let me go ahead and put in those sections one more time. Voila. All right. So this is our last example, showing a little bit more technical capabilities, but basically, if you're able to read the first sample, you're able to read the last one. And like I said before, this is just a little bit more customized to what they need in the recording process for the recording of this particular cue in the film, 102 Dalmatians. So stick around, I've got a surprise for you. All right, so there we are, all 3 samples for you to check out. Each sample gives you a little bit of an understanding of how things might go in the real world. So I really do hope that helps you out with your musical endeavors. So there we are, episode 3. I might have an episode 4 coming up when we talk a little bit more in depth about abbreviations, a little bit more fine tuning and fine details that you'll find on the page. So stick around for that. All right, we talked about a surprise I had for you. I've gone ahead and created some templates, some writing templates for you, one in landscape and one more vertical, so that you guys can go ahead and make your own sketches, your own motifs, put down your ideas. They're made for you. They're in PDF form, so you can go ahead and print them out. They are 11 by 17 in size, so hopefully you have a printer that's big enough. If not, you can always downsize that to a regular 8.5 by 11 size. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Santiago Valencia. If you think you can benefit from the information on this channel, go ahead and subscribe and then give a like on this video if you'd be so kind. Love to hear from you in the comments. And until then, it's been a real slice. Take care.